Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at substance abuse, and we're using the film A Beautiful Boy as a lens to kind of explore some of the complexities of it. This film is based on a true story, and I think it's really powerful in the way that it portrays the kind of devastation that addiction brings not only to individuals, but to their families as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that A Beautiful Boy does so well is it raises these really tough questions about the nature of addiction and, why it takes hold, the challenges of recovery, and really all of the different contributing factors that can kind of lead someone down that path.
So let's kind of unpack that a little bit. The film centers around Nic Sheff, and he seems to have it all on the surface. He's got a loving family, he's talented, gets accepted at every college he applies to, but underneath it all, he's battling this really powerful addiction. And his substance of choice primarily is crystal meth.
Yeah, and it's that contrast, that how could this happen sort of feeling that I think really draws people into the story. Because he is this promising young man. And yet, like so many individuals that we see in our work, there's this underlying struggle with addiction. And I think the film does a good job of really kind of tracing that progression of addiction from early experimentation with different substances to the escalation to crystal meth and really showing the toll it takes on his life and those around him.
One detail from the film that stuck with me was this mention of Nic feeling pressure to be the perfect son for his father.
Yep.
And it kind of makes you wonder, how often did those kinds of pressures, whether real or perceived, contribute to someone hiding their struggles, especially in those crucial formative years?
It's incredibly common, actually. There's often this fear of not living up to expectations of being seen as flawed or weak or somehow, less than. And that can make it so difficult for individuals to open up about what they're going through, especially when it comes to something like addiction, which still carries so much stigma with it.
Yeah, and there's definitely this theme in the film of a desperate search for answers.
Yeah.
You see Nic's father, diving into research, trying to understand why this is happening.
Yeah.
And it really mirrors the struggle that I think a lot of loved ones go through and that you probably encounter in your work every day.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Nic's father discovers through his research is how crystal meth actually changes the brain itself. It leads to a really drastic drop in dopamine after use. And, that has a profound impact on the way that the individual experiences pleasure and reward.
It's interesting because, there's this question that the film raises. Is it purely biological or is there more to it? Nic talks about this big black hole that he's trying to fill with drugs. And it kind of makes you think about, how do individuals who are struggling with addiction, how do they articulate that sense of emptiness? What does that feel like for them?
Yeah, that's a really powerful analogy. And I think it resonates with a lot of what individuals express, the sense of profound emptiness, lack of fulfillment. And they're searching for something to numb the pain, to escape a reality that just feels unbearable. And sometimes, substances can seem like the answer to that.
One of the things that the film does really well is it highlights just how hard it is to break free even after periods of sobriety. There's this one scene where Nic relapses after running into a girl he used to date. And it kind of raises this question of, how do you as a professional work with your patients to help them identify and navigate potential triggers in their environment?
Yeah.
Because those triggers are everywhere.
It's one of the cornerstones of addiction treatment, really. We work with individuals on recognizing those triggers, understanding, what situations, people, or even emotions might increase their risk of relapse. And, helping them develop strategies to cope with those triggers when they do arise.
Because it's often, relapse is part of the recovery journey. And it's not a failure, right? It's an opportunity to learn and to kind of keep moving forward.
Exactly. And I think that's a message that we try to really emphasize with our patients. That, recovery is not a linear process. There are going to be bumps in the road. And it's about how you learn from those bumps and how you keep moving forward towards your goals.
The film also really brings home the point that addiction is not just an individual struggle. It impacts the entire family. You see David, going from being this kind of first responder trying to fix everything to realizing that he needs to step back and let Nic kind of take responsibility for his own recovery. It's a really powerful dynamic and one that, we've talked about before in the context of addiction as a family disease.
It is absolutely a family disease.
Yeah.
And it's so important to, provide support not only to the individual struggling, but to the family as well, because they're often, deeply affected, grappling with feelings of helplessness, anger, sometimes guilt, and helping them understand the dynamics of addiction is just as important as working with the individual themselves.
And the film kind of takes us through, different treatment methods that Nic undergoes. There's detox, there's inpatient rehab. But as the film highlights and as your own work demonstrates, success isn't guaranteed. So what are some of those contributing factors that you've observed in your practice that go beyond just the clinical aspects of treatment? What makes a difference in someone's recovery journey?
Well, it's never as simple as just the treatment itself. Motivation is huge, and that can fluctuate throughout the recovery process. And having a strong support system, a stable environment, addressing any underlying mental health conditions, those all play a really crucial role. And I think A Beautiful Boy gives us some glimpses into those factors. And it really showcases the complexities that clinicians like yourself are navigating every day.
Right, and kind of reinforces this idea that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. There's no quick fix. Recovery is an ongoing process, a journey with potential setbacks and relapses, as the film so honestly portrays.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the film's strengths. It portrays recovery realistically. It acknowledges those struggles, the potential for relapse, and the importance of continued support and commitment throughout the journey.
There's this really poignant scene in the film where David tells Nick, "I love you more than life itself, but I can't save you." And it's tough love, but it's also this really important message that ultimately recovery has to come from within. And that resonates with a lot of the approaches we've talked about, in our discussions.
It's a powerful moment, and it speaks to the necessity of setting boundaries.
Mm.
Recognizing that as much as we want, we can't force someone to change. Our role is to support, to guide, to provide resources, but ultimately, the individual has to be the driving force behind their own recovery.
And it's a really delicate balance, right?
Hmm.
Knowing when to offer support and when to encourage that individual responsibility. Because it's not about giving up on someone. It's about recognizing that true change comes from within.
Absolutely, and it's something that, clinicians grapple with all the time. How do you provide that balance of support and accountability? And I think the film does a good job of kind of showing those different sides of it.
So, A Beautiful Boy, it's a tough film to watch at times, but it does offer these glimpses of hope throughout, both Nick's journey and his father's journey. It highlights the power of family, the importance of connection, and the strength that can emerge from adversity. But in your experience, what are some of those unexpected sources of strength that you've seen patients tap into during their recovery? Where does that resilience come from?
It's amazing to see how resilient the human spirit can be. And I've seen patients find strength in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it's reconnecting with their creativity, rediscovering their passions, or finding purpose in helping others who are also struggling. And sometimes it's simply the act of choosing to get up each day and keep fighting that becomes its own source of strength.
It speaks to the fact that even in the darkest moments, there are always those glimmers of hope, those sparks of possibility. And I think that's a really important message to hold on to, especially when we're talking about something as challenging as addiction.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that we need to remind ourselves of as clinicians as well,
Yeah.
to keep believing in the possibility of change and to keep supporting our patients even when they're struggling, because recovery is possible and it's worth fighting for.
And that's something that the film really drives home, that there's always hope, even when things seem incredibly difficult, and that there's beauty, even in the midst of pain.
Yeah. And I think that's where the title of the film, A Beautiful Boy, comes in. It's a reminder that even in the midst of addiction, there's still that beauty, that humanity, that spark of something special, and that deserves to be nurtured and supported.
We've spoken a lot about the individual and family struggles, but how have you seen societal attitudes towards addiction evolve over the course of your career? Have you noticed any significant shifts in how we as a society approach this issue?
Yeah, there's definitely been progress, albeit it's slow. We're starting to see a shift away from blaming and shaming towards a more compassionate and understanding approach. There's a growing recognition that addiction is a complex health issue, not a moral failing. And that shift is so crucial for breaking down stigma and encouraging people to seek help without fear of judgment.
And the film kind of touches on that through David's journey.
Yeah.
Initially, he struggles with feelings of guilt and shame, blaming himself for Nick's addiction. But as he learns more about the nature of addiction, he starts to let go of those self-recriminations. And that internal struggle that he experiences kind of mirrors the larger societal shift that I think we need to see.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that, we need to move away from blame and towards compassion and support. And that's a process. There's still work to be done. But the growing awareness of addiction as a disease, as something that requires treatment and support rather than punishment is definitely a positive step forward.
And it's a step that can have a real impact on people's lives, on their willingness to reach out for help, and on their chances of recovery. And speaking of recovery, A Beautiful Boy doesn't provide any easy answers or guarantees, but it does showcase those moments of resilience, those glimmers of hope that keep both Nick and his father going.
And I think that's one of the most important takeaways for our listeners today. The reminder that recovery is possible even amidst the setbacks and the challenges. It requires persistence, it requires support, and it requires a belief in the possibility of change.
And, as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, what stands out to you as the most crucial takeaway from the film in terms of understanding the broader context of substance abuse? What do you hope people will walk away thinking about?
I think A Beautiful Boy provides this incredibly personal, intimate look at addiction, but it also reminds us that this issue goes far beyond any individual story. There are societal, cultural, systemic factors at play that we need to address if we want to make meaningful progress in preventing and treating substance abuse. It's a complex issue that demands a multifaceted approach, one that encompasses individual treatment, family support, and broader societal change.
Yeah, it's about looking at the whole picture.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual choices or willpower. It's about understanding the complex interplay of factors that contribute to addiction. And it's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to heal and thrive.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important message to end on. It's about hope, it's about possibility, and it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a world where addiction is no longer such a devastating force.
One thing that really struck me while watching the film is just how visible the consequences of substance abuse are in Nick's life. The film really doesn't hold back in depicting the physical and mental decline, the strained relationships, the financial burdens. It's all laid bare.
It's true. A Beautiful Boy really presents a very raw, unfiltered look at that devastation. And you're right, it's not just the individual who suffers. We see the emotional toll that it takes on Nick's family, the constant worry and fear. And it echoes what we often discuss, addiction as this ripple effect impacting entire support networks.
There's this one scene where Nick is walking and you notice a limp. And it's subtle, but it's this really stark visual reminder of the lasting damage that crystal meth can inflict on the body.
And I think if we connect that to the bigger picture, that scene highlights something really crucial. Substance abuse isn't just an emotional or mental health issue. It has these very real physical ramifications. And with crystal meth in particular, the neurological and physiological damage can be really profound.
It makes you think about, the public perception of addiction, right? It's often seen as this moral failing, a lack of willpower. But the film does a good job of challenging those assumptions by showing the very real and very devastating physical consequences.
It forces the viewer to confront the reality that addiction is a disease. It's a disease that affects the brain and the body in these profound ways. And as you know, it's not just about the individual's health. The film also touches upon the economic fallout, the financial burdens that addiction can place on families, which is something that's often overlooked.
Absolutely. Treatment medications, lost income, it all adds up. And those financial strains can, in turn, create even more stress and tension within the family, making the situation even more challenging. Speaking of treatment, we see Nic trying various approaches, detox, followed by inpatient rehab, things that are very familiar to you in your work. But as the film highlights, and as your own work, I'm sure demonstrates, success isn't guaranteed. So what are some of those contributing factors that you've observed that go beyond just the clinical aspects of treatment? What are some of the things that really make a difference in someone's recovery journey?
It's such a multifaceted issue. Patient motivation is huge, and that can fluctuate throughout the recovery process. Having a solid support system, a stable environment, addressing any underlying mental health conditions, these are all vital pieces of the puzzle. And I think A Beautiful Boy gives us glimpses into these factors. It really showcases the complexities that clinicians like you navigate every day.
And it really reinforces the idea that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, no quick fix. Recovery is an ongoing process, a journey with potential setbacks and relapses, which the film doesn't shy away from.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the film's strengths. It portrays recovery realistically. It acknowledges those struggles, the potential for relapse, and the importance of continued support and commitment.
There's this really poignant scene where David tells Nic, "I love you more than life itself, but I can't save you." And it's tough love, but it also underscores that ultimately recovery has to come from within. It's a point that resonates with a lot of the approaches we've discussed in our pre-show discussions.
It's a powerful moment, and it speaks to the necessity of setting boundaries, recognizing that as much as we want to, we can't force someone to change. Our role is to support, to guide, to provide resources, but ultimately the individual has to be the driving force behind their own recovery. And, that's a delicate balance that clinicians like yourself face daily, knowing when to offer support and when to encourage that individual responsibility. It's not about giving up on someone. It's about recognizing that true change has to come from within.
And Beautiful Boy offers these glimpses of hope throughout Nick and David's journey. It highlights the power of family, the importance of connection, and the strength that can emerge from adversity. But I'm curious, in your professional experience, what are some of those unexpected sources of strength that you've seen patients tap into during their recovery? Where does that resilience come from?
It's remarkable how resilient the human spirit can be. I've seen patients find strength in the most unexpected places, reconnecting with their creativity, rediscovering their passions, even finding purpose in helping others who are also struggling. And sometimes it's simply the act of choosing to get up each day and keep fighting that becomes its own source of strength.
It speaks to the fact that even in the darkest moments, there are always those glimmers of hope. And the film also touches on something we mentioned earlier, those broader societal factors that contribute to substance abuse.
Yes, and I think it's important to acknowledge that A Beautiful Boy primarily focuses on Nick's individual story. However, it does offer these hints at those broader societal influences.
We see the pressures that he faces, the glorification of drug use in certain circles, the lack of accessible mental health resources, particularly for young people, and it all feeds into this complex web of factors that can make someone vulnerable to addiction.
And this connects to a point you raised in our earlier conversations about how the portrayal of substance use in media can influence perceptions, especially among young people. And this is such a critical aspect of prevention, and one that requires a multi-pronged approach from education to policy changes.
It's about addressing the systemic issues that contribute to the problem,
Mm.
not just focusing on individual treatment. And while A Beautiful Boy might not delve deeply into these aspects, it at least sparks those crucial conversations.
It reminds us that while individual stories are essential, understanding addiction and its impact requires looking beyond the individual to the broader societal context. It's about recognizing the systemic factors that contribute to the problem, from socioeconomic disparities to inadequate access to healthcare.
We've spoken a lot about the individual and family struggles, but how have you seen societal attitudes towards addiction evolve over the course of your career? Have you noticed any significant shifts in how we as a society approach this issue?
There's definitely been progress, albeit slow. We're starting to see a shift away from blaming and shaming towards a more compassionate and understanding approach. There's a growing recognition that addiction is a complex health issue, not a moral failing. And this shift is crucial for breaking down stigma and encouraging people to seek help without fear of judgment.
The film kind of touches on this through David's journey.
Hmm.
Initially, he struggles with feelings of guilt and shame, blaming himself for Nick's addiction. But as he learns more about the nature of addiction, he begins to let go of those self-recriminations. And that internal struggle he experiences kind of mirrors that larger societal shift in understanding that we need to move away from blame and toward compassion and support.
It's a process, and there's still work to be done, but the growing awareness of addiction as a disease is something that requires treatment and support rather than punishment is definitely a positive step forward.
And it's a step that can have a real impact on people's lives, on their willingness to reach out for help, and on their chances of recovery. Speaking of recovery, A Beautiful Boy doesn't provide any easy answers or guarantees, but it does showcase those moments of resilience, those glimmers of hope that keep both Nick and his father going.
And I think that's one of the most important takeaways for our listener, the reminder that recovery is possible even amidst setbacks and challenges. It requires persistent support and a belief in the possibility of change.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what stands out to you as the most crucial takeaway from the film in terms of understanding the broader context of substance abuse?
A Beautiful Boy provides a very personal, intimate look at addiction, but it also reminds us that this issue goes far beyond any individual story. There are societal, cultural, and systemic factors at play that we need to address if we want to make meaningful progress in preventing and treating substance abuse. It's a complex issue that demands a multifaceted approach, one that encompasses individual treatment, family support, and broader societal change.
It feels like we keep circling back to this idea that individual stories like Nick's, while powerful, are just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, there's this whole web of societal factors that we can't ignore. What are some of the key areas where you see the need for more attention, more research, more resources, especially given what we've seen in the film and what you know from your own experience?
Well, one area that really stands out to me is the need for more comprehensive prevention programs. A Beautiful Boy touches on Nick's early experimentation with drugs, and it makes you think about how we can intervene earlier before substance use escalates into a full-blown addiction.
Hmm.
We need to equip young people with the knowledge and the skills to make healthy choices, to resist peer pressure, and to understand the risks involved.
It's interesting you bring that up because it aligns with a lot of the research that you shared with me before this deep dive,
Yeah.
specifically those studies highlighting the influence of social circles and peer dynamics on adolescent substance use.
Mm.
It's not just about individual choices, it's about the environment that they're navigating.
Exactly. And that environment includes the messages that they're bombarded with every day, from advertising to social media to popular culture. The film, though, subtly does portray how drug use is often glamorized, portrayed as a symbol of rebellion or a way to cope with stress. And we need to counter those narratives with accurate information about the risks and the consequences of substance abuse.
The film also kind of makes you think about the lack of accessible mental health resources, something we touched on earlier. Nian clearly struggles with this emotional turmoil, with that sense of emptiness he describes. And it makes you wonder how many individuals turn to substances as a way to self-medicate, to cope with underlying mental health issues that aren't being addressed.
That's a really critical point. Substance abuse and mental health disorders so often go hand in hand. Untreated anxiety, depression, trauma, these can all increase the risk of addiction. So we need to improve access to mental health services, especially for young people, and create a system where seeking help for mental health concerns is seen as normal and encouraged, just like seeking help for any other health issue.
It feels like there's this stigma still surrounding mental health, this idea that it's something to be ashamed of or hidden. And that stigma can prevent people from getting the help they need, pushing them towards these unhealthy coping mechanisms, including substance use.
Absolutely. Breaking down that stigma is crucial. And it goes beyond just individual attitudes. It's about creating systemic change, ensuring that mental health services are adequately funded, accessible, and integrated into our healthcare system.
So we've talked about prevention, we've talked about mental health resources, but there's also the treatment piece. A Beautiful Boy shows Nick going through detox rehab therapy. What are your thoughts on the current state of addiction treatment? Are we doing enough? Are there areas where you see a need for improvement?
There have been significant advancements in addiction treatment, particularly in understanding the neurobiology of addiction and developing evidence-based therapies. But there's always room for improvement. We need to make treatment more accessible, more affordable, more tailored to individual needs. And we need to address those underlying social determinants of health that contribute to addiction, like poverty, housing, instability, lack of access to education and employment opportunities.
That's a really important point, addressing the root causes of addiction, not just the symptoms. Because, if someone's struggling with poverty, with homelessness, with systemic barriers, their chances of successful recovery are significantly diminished regardless of the treatment they receive.
Exactly. It's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, to reach their full potential. And that means addressing those systemic inequities that contribute to addiction and so many other social problems.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into A Beautiful Boy and the complexities of substance abuse, what's the key message you want to leave our listeners with? What do you hope people will take away from this conversation?
I think the film, even with its focus on one family's story, really reminds us that addiction is a multifaceted issue. It's a public health crisis that demands a comprehensive response. It requires a shift in our understanding, away from blame and shame towards compassion and support. It requires investment in prevention and mental health resources, in evidence-based treatment, and in addressing those underlying social determinants of health.
It's about recognizing that addiction is not a personal failing. It's a complex issue that requires a collective response. And A Beautiful Boy might not offer all the answers, but it opens our eyes to the struggles, the heartbreak, and the glimmers of hope that exist within this really multifaceted issue. And for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive encourages continued learning, challenging assumptions, and advocating for a world where every individual has the opportunity to heal and thrive.